All right, welcome. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Sharon Goldstein. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm well. How are you?
I've mispronounced the names of my last two guests after working on it for a long time. So thank you for being an easy name to say, finally. So let me see if I get your background right. First of all, you came from Kellogg. You went to Kellogg, which is a rarity here in Silicon Valley.
There's a group of us out here. I think the interesting thing about business school out here is that it's not everyone appreciates it, so it's not something that those of us who have gone necessarily broadcast in the same way that they do in other industries.
But I find if I haven't researched a guest and I ask them if they went to Stanford or Harvard, I'm generally right. It's generally one of those two. But yeah, there's a couple people. There's Gil Pinchina, there's Sam Shank, there's Todd Francis. There's I could think of 5 of them or something like that. Bit of a rarity around here.
Yeah, I mean, there's more. There's Scott Jample at OpenTable. There's Jason Spiro, who's a VP inside of Google. There's actually quite a few of us. I think we just don't walk around and wear the brand in the same way.
Yeah, that's probably right. And if you went to Harvard and you do I went to school in Boston, it doesn't really work to say, I went to school in Illinois, because people have no idea what you're talking about. Chicago, where'd you go? So your background, you have been the director of strategy at Shutterfly, the VP of business development at PhotoBucket, the CMO of Pixlee, and most recently the CRO, that's Chief Revenue Officer at Shiphawk, and you're on the board of the Hebrew Free Loan. No.
Correct.
Is that how you say Hebrew Free Loan, or the Hebrew Free Loan?
The name is actually the Hebrew Free Loan Association of the Bay Area, but that's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
And so usually people just say Hebrew Free Loan.
But what is that, by the way? That's it's amazing. You meet people, you kind of never really know what they do, their nonprofit thing. The CEO who I work with at Nuzzle is he's on the board of Girls in Tech. But Adriana Gascoigne's thing, but you never know it. It just kind of. I never knew that you were on the board of that. So what is that organization?
It's one of the coolest organizations you've never heard of. First of all, it's 120 years old.
Okay.
And we have almost $10 million out in revolving money in no interest loans. Right. So basically, 2 funds inside the organization. We give money. The main program gives money for people for debt consolidation, for programs such as being able to study for their bar exams without having to work in the window of time, for things like fertility loans. And that's inside the Jewish community. And then we have a second fund that gives student loans to underprivileged students. Many of them are first time or first in their family, and they're able to get these no interest loans to help cover the gaps between what they get from traditional financial aid and what they need to actually be able to stay in school.
Wow, that is very cool.
Yeah, it's a great organization. It literally started with a community. It's original community lending, and it started with a loan for someone to buy a push cart, back during the gold rush.
Yeah.
So
that's really interesting. I do wonder sometimes about Silicon Valley, people giving back. A lot of people do, but I talked to a financial advisor recently who advises a bunch of people on giving, and it's his clients have $5 to $10 million kind of thing. So I'm always curious, what the hell do they do with that money? That seems like a lot of money to me. And he's listed a bunch of things they do. He's interestingly, they don't give a lot away, which I thought was I was wow, that's kind of surprising. You would think if you had that much money, you'd spend a lot of time giving it away. And the only thing I could conclude is that's an amount of money, which is a ton of money. But if you have that much money, your main focus is not running out of money, is all I could figure out. If you had $100 million, you wouldn't worry about it. You'd give more money away. That was my generous take on it. But I was wow, that's kind of a surprising thing to hear.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many different philosophies around philanthropy. And I do see in the Bay Area, we do see that a lot of the money comes in from a bequest structure, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think if you either have a philosophy of abundance or a philosophy of scarcity. And if you have a philosophy of scarcity in life, it does not matter how much money you have. You're always worried about losing it, right? Some of those people do give it away when they pass away, and some do not.
And that might be the right strategy, where you're look, I don't know if I'm going to live to be 70 or 90. So we'll keep it, but then at the end, it all goes to the Humane Society or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm a huge fan of philanthropic giving, and I think that there's something very rewarding about giving your money away as you go, and also helping you realize where that money is going.
Right.
But as long as at the end of the day the money makes it into those programs, I guess it doesn't matter, which way you go.
Give money, people. So what is your path to Silicon Valley? Like, how do you come from Kellogg to from Northwestern to Silicon Valley, and then you kind of moved from consumer companies into sort of not consumer companies? Like, how did that path work?
Sure. So I started my career actually in supply chain, and it was this stodgy old industry. I went to Georgia Tech. I had an industrial engineering degree, and went off to business school, worked for Accenture in their strategy group, went off to business school fully expecting to go back, and was in school during the tech boom, the original boom, graduating in 99. And over that summer, I was like, I'm going to go play in the tech industry, went off to Real Networks in Seattle, who had just launched just launched video on the web. It's so funny when you talk about your background in tech, because things move so quickly. It makes you sound like a dinosaur, even if you're not. And actually worked on a software as a service platform. They didn't call it that back then, and just got the bug. And so I did not end up in Silicon Valley at that time, but I went off to Real Networks and did product management there, and spent 5.5 years at the company, moved to London with them, running the mobile business, and then after 2 years in London, decided that that it was time to come back, and found a startup that wanted to bring me back, and made it to Silicon Valley. Actually ended up having my own consulting business for multiple years before I went to Shutterfly, helping startups get going. And it was really fun. And it was early in mobile too, because so people were really interested in how to have a great consumer experience.
And your background was engineering, is that right?
Yes, it was industrial engineering.
But then you didn't actually become an engineer, which is interesting. Like, everyone thinks there's one thing you do in Silicon Valley, which is be an engineer. In fact, Google employs many more salespeople than engineers, like by a mile. So it's so funny when I talk to people, and they just I'm not an engineer, but have been doing tech companies for 15 years. People are always surprised. So how did you pick the path into sort of I guess you became a C-level person. You became a chief marketing type of person, right?
Yeah. So there were a couple questions in there. I think, what interested me about industrial engineering, and this drives to where the path took me, is that it was the engineering of management and systems and people.
Right.
And so when I went off and did Accenture, I actually was doing supply chain strategy. And that was, again, those pieces. After business school, when I came out, really what I wanted to do is leverage that into product. So that's how I ended up in product management. And then over time, I mean, it's funny going to Kellogg, actually, because I took no marketing classes at Kellogg beyond the minimum, but you come out of Kellogg and everyone just declares you a marketer.
Yeah.
And the roles of really being able to set strategy and set narrative and decide how the company is thought of in the world is really in that piece.
Yeah.
And so my focus since Real has really been monetization and acquisition, and a lot of that's through telling a compelling narrative about the company. And so the roles as I've gone through have really been about where do I help a company drive the next wave of revenue and next wave of customers, and those roles are not always in the same functional group depending on what company you're talking to.
It's so funny going to Kellogg. It's a marketing school. I majored in finance. And everyone's like, oh, it's not that great a finance school. I'm like, do you really think I'm so smart that I'm outstripping the finance? The finance professors at Northwestern are from the University of Chicago. You really think I'm so smart that I'm just beyond the finance teachers? But it was a pretty fun place to go to school.
It was a great place to go to school. Yeah.
And one of the funny things they do, it's a marketing school. And so everybody, you rate the teachers. So if a teacher's not really good, my accounting teacher was this woman who was the most interesting person I'd ever been in a class with. And it's because if you weren't really good, you just get, the survey comes in and like you head out the door.
Yeah, I think by now most of the business schools do that, but it was certainly early in that process.
Yeah.
And there's still more finance, more organizational behavior majors than there are marketing majors.
Yeah.
This reputation that Kellogg has is very much driven by the fact that General Mills and Kellogg and the large CPGs hire out of the school, but it's it really is much broader than that, as you and I both show.
Yeah, I highly recommend. I went to Northwestern undergrad too, and I keep telling. When I went, it was a backup school. Like I was going to go to Harvard and whatever, didn't get in, so I went to Northwestern. Now everyone's like, yeah, it's not really a backup school anymore. It's like it's a first choice school for like their kids can't get in. So, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit. So we were talking briefly about the Women's March and like the election, which just seems like kind of a shame to me. But did you do like the women's? So here in San Francisco, there was like a Women's March, and there were women's marches around the world, and this was kind of like in the lee of the election when everybody was still protesting every week. What was your what are you thinking about this whole thing?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm a Democrat. I'm going to start there. It's a sort of an obvious thing in the Bay Area, but not always correct.
Yeah.
And I remember, of course, the evening when Trump was elected, and it really had an impact. And what was crazy, right? Let's all think back to this, is the emotional impact that really it had on people. Like the next day, you saw people like crying in corners.
Yeah.
For me, I had been at Barack Obama's inauguration 8 years before, and just that change in how the country thought of itself was so crazy for me that I decided I had to go to the Women's March.
Right.
So I actually went to Washington and was there and
so you
participated.
went to the real one. Yeah. I mean, they're all real, but
they were all, yeah. I mean, a lot of people weren't able to go to Washington for various reasons. A lot of people, families or other commitments. Yeah. But going there, it just felt like being on the, lawn of the White House, definitely being at the source was important.
What was it like?
It was incredibly powerful. First of all, I've never seen a crowd that large that is so kind to each other. And that was amazing. Yeah. We were like sardines. I was about 3 blocks back from the stage. Mm-hmm. And there was so much energy around. And really, people talk about the Women's March and whether it had an impact.
Right.
And I think a lot of the impact was giving people the knowledge that there were others like them.
Right.
B, some conversation to have and to take home, and C, a level of accountability, right? If changes don't happen, it's our fault, the royal we, because there is the power, there is the energy behind it. Now, some of the challenges, there were so many different agendas there, everything from the pro-life agenda to the transgender agenda to, the anti-Trump agenda. And so really what people were out there doing is showing their unhappiness with where we were going and their interest in activating and moving forward.
Yeah. It's interesting. What happens next? Like, what's the next protest anybody goes to? I mean, to me, the whole election seems like just such a waste. Like, it didn't have to happen. It wasn't a landslide. A lot of people were like not taking it very, I'm going to write in John Oliver. And now people are, so that makes it, so Donald Trump gets elected and everything's like 90% worse. And you protest and it's like 5% better. But it still just seems like such a waste to me. Like, as opposed to if everyone just went out and voted and we just had Hillary Clinton, life would be so much better. It just seems to me.
Yeah, I mean.
I'm not seeing a silver lining. Like, the protests and all that, I'm kind of like, it's good, but I'd just rather have Hillary Clinton as president.
Yeah, well, we can't go back and change history. I think there's some interesting things going on that hopefully will change 2018, which is really the next target, right? That's the opportunity to make change. I mean, there's programs like Indivisible, right? The grassroots
right.
program
Yep.
that is very strong in San Francisco, but is apparently active in every medium and large city in the country, and is really focused on going after your specific representatives as opposed to the broader agenda. So that's really powerful. It's basically the concept that there are 3 people who care about you in Washington, and those are the people who you vote for, and that's who you should spend your energy on. There are programs like Tech for Campaigns, which is being run here, which is the idea that social media and all the email programs and things that we take for granted in tech companies isn't always available to legislators, and they don't necessarily have those skill sets. So it's a volunteer program to, help people who are running for office actually have access and, better campaigns. So those are 2 of the things that are happening. And then there's actually a huge movement to get women to run for office.
Yep.
And, if you look at the stats around women running for office, they're pretty abysmal. I mean, only 1 in 5 of our members of Congress are female. And since the year of I'm doing air quotes, the year of the woman, which was 1992, right after the Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas situation, where we ended up with 28 new members of Congress who were female, we really have stagnated.
Yeah.
And so hopefully what we're going to see out of this is an actual difference in who is running locally at the state level as well as at the national level for office. And it doesn't have to be, it's interesting because this push is really around women running for office, but the reality is if there's a silver lining, the silver lining is potentially engagement.
Yeah.
Engagement of our society in politics again, and hopefully male or female.
Yep. We
will have people get out and run, and we'll also have people get out the vote.
Yep. By the way, speaking of women in politics, Eve Phillips, who is she's the CEO of Empower Interactive and an engineer from MIT. She's the mayor of Orinda now.
Oh, that's very cool.
So yeah, so there you go, women in tech. Yeah, I find like the most satisfying thing, other than just getting mad at CNN all the time, is local. Like Scott Wiener's this local supervisor here, and he was running for state senate, and like I kind of liked him and gave him just like a little bit of money, and he sent me a little thank you note, and he's our state senator. So it's not the same as like Hillary Clinton and getting a picture with her and all that, but I'm like, wait, I know that guy. And I went to a little fundraiser and he won his little thing. I'm like, maybe that's like better for people. Like maybe that actually impacts your life more to know the local people or go run for. And there's some crazy number of like 400 or 500,000 local offices in the country. Like there's a lot of jobs, if nothing else.
Yeah, first of all, getting to know people who are running for office is always powerful, and sometimes it's pay to play and sometimes it's not. Yep. Scott Wiener, who I'm a huge fan of, our legislature in Sacramento has an incredible amount of power, right?
Yep.
California is this massive economy. Some of them are more powerful than in national roles.
Yep.
As far as, locally and all those roles, a lot of them are nominated, a lot of them are volunteer. If someone wants to go and be part of our government, like that opportunity is there. Yep. And so you don't have to like go run for, follow Wiener in order to get there.
It's if you like your drama in politics too, it's very dramatic because he was running against a woman named Jane Kim.
Right.
Bernie Sanders came into California and all of a sudden backs Jane Kim for whatever reason, and all of a sudden, it was like, if you like a little intrigue in politics, you get it on the local level as well as the national level.
Absolutely. One of the things that's actually great about Wiener and a place where I think, tech, putting out a plug to get people from tech to run for office. One of the things that's really powerful about him is he's very data driven. Mm-hmm. Right, and seems to be based very rational in how he thinks about things, versus deciding, at intuition level or deciding at, constituent level. He of course takes into account things that his constituents care about, but the idea of using data to drive these decisions sounds like it should be so obvious.
Yep.
And yet it's fairly unique, I feel like, in politics these days. And we really need more people who are going to start with the data, think about that impact, and make their decisions that way versus, what the latest soundbite is.
Yeah, he's a big, I won't repeat what he says about housing because I'll get it wrong, but it's very thoughtful. Like when you think about housing in San Francisco, everyone's like, it sucks, it's too expensive. It's about that complicated. But he's got this really nuanced ideas about homeless people and housing and how it works, which is I don't know if that works well for a politician because you got to listen and think about it a little bit. And he doesn't have the great soundbite. It's easy to attack him, but he seems pretty thoughtful about that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Kent, that you just nailed the issue with politics today, which is if people are really going to get involved and we're really going to get the country in a direction that we want, we have to get involved beyond the soundbite. Right. And sometimes the politicians who aren't as good in front of the camera are really the better politicians because they're looking at the nuances of these problems.
Right.
President Obama once had said that by the time a problem gets to him, I can't quote him directly, but by the time a problem gets to him, it's a hard problem with no clear solution.
Yep.
Right? And so that's the type of problem that our legislators are looking at, and we need to value their interest in nuance.
Yep, totally. You're a pretty high-level female executive in Silicon Valley. What is the state? This is my specialty on the podcast, is going if you're a white guy who doesn't think you're committing any biases or sexually harassing anybody, and you're not getting sexually harassed, obviously, right? You kind of, it's not that you don't think it doesn't happen, but you're kind of often just surprised. Someone will tell you something, you're like, really? That goes on? What is the state of women in Silicon? What do you think the issue is with the... what should we be thinking about if you're a reasonable guy, women in Silicon Valley? Women march and all that is important, but okay, we're here in Silicon Valley and this is where I control a couple things. What do you think the issues are that I should be thinking about? Wow.
Okay. That is a broad question.
Yeah.
Let me pick out a couple of things. One is, and to your point, of being a good player, right? There are good players and bad players, and the bad players tend to be great news. Uber being the key example in 2017.
What the hell is up with Uber? What? It's not it seems like it's not that hard. Every company I've been in that scales to a certain level, you become professional. There was a woman at Uber who was getting ridiculously 101 sexual harass, and she went to HR, which normally is just okay, this is there's 10 things that are about to happen, and they were just you should keep your mouth shut. What the...
I mean, I'm not there, so all I can do is posit, but culture comes from the top.
Jeez.
Right?
Yeah.
And people really do. I think if you look at the line of items that have happened, the timeline of activities at Uber, this is not an isolated incident, right? And if you look back, there's a lot of suppressed incidents. This is about whether the company can fundamentally change the behavior of the organization, and it sounds systemic, right? But that is not, to your question about the state of women in tech, that is not the norm. And not every company is Uber, and not every leader is Travis.
Right.
And in general, what I found is that most men I meet would like women to succeed. They like working with women. They are advocates for the people they work with. Now, there's still an issue of unconscious bias and certain behaviors that happen.
Yep.
So, the most notable one tends to be interrupting. And even men who are, huge fans of their team and their players, what you see in meetings is that women are interrupted more And sometimes they're the only ones interrupted in those meetings, right? And so as someone who wants women to do well, an easy thing to do is just be really conscious of that and stop other people from interrupting, right? So that there's like a set of items that get listed out. Some of the organizations that are driving women in leadership have the lists, but that is the most obvious one, and it's one that I personally experience on a regular basis, regardless of what type of meeting I'm in.
And how is that? I've heard this a bunch, by the way, and don't see it. Like, I don't like. I know I'm supposed to see it, but I don't see it, which means I'm probably doing it and not noticing. How do you know it's not just like, I feel like I interrupt guys all the time too. Like, don't I? Or do they tell me to shut up quicker and interrupt me back? Or what exactly is going like?
I don't know. You haven't interrupted me yet, so I'll flag it if you do. But I think there's certain cultures where everyone's interrupting everyone. That's a little different. If you sit in enough meetings, you'll notice it. Like, if you actually say, I'm going to pay attention and see where this happens.
So we have one woman on our team of 6. She's an engineer, and people will say like, okay, did you have anything else to say? Like, they'll be conscious of it. But is that a bias too? Like, is that like a protective bias where you're like protecting somebody? Like, hey, don't interrupt her.
It's a good question. There are people on teams, both male and female, who tend not to speak till the end, right? You've got the early participants, and then you've got those people who sit back and you need to ask. In general, what I'd like to do is say no one should be interrupted on either side, and everyone should have the opportunity to weigh in, right? If you have someone who's quiet, a lot of times those are women, but not always, stopping and just asking for them to weigh in gets to the point where over time you don't have to.
Yep.
Because they will feel comfortable speaking up.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely speaking of Eve Phillips, she gets regularly asked who her technical co-founder is, right? Obviously it's her. She's the engineer. But like, what other sort of, I guess, let me put this is going to be a really dumb question, but if you're a woman in Silicon Valley, there's unlimited demand for engineers everywhere. You're a female engineer. Why would you go to Uber? Like, I imagine Facebook is pretty good. Like, Sheryl Sandberg's not running some sloppy, horrible place. Like, why would you stay? Like, why not just leave Uber and go, screw you guys. Like, I'm going to go to Facebook or Google or some company that it doesn't have this kind, and maybe that's what's happening, actually.
Well, so in the world of why would you go, and then we'll talk about why would you stay. Yeah. In the world of why would you go, Uber is a high-flying company, yeah. Right? They are looking for engineers. Their problems are so interesting. They're, mapping. They're continually innovating. So for both men and women, it's an interesting place to go. Yeah. As far as why wouldn't you leave, my hypothesis is that that a lot of them don't leave because if you have options from early, you can't afford to buy your options.
Right.
And if you're there and you're vesting, even if you're miserable, a lot of times there's so much potential value on the table. I feel like companies like Uber, like Pinterest, a lot of the unicorns, there are people who feel trapped because they see the potential value and it is in conflict with their level of happiness and satisfaction day to day.
Right. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And by the way, the people you're working with could be good. It can't be that every guy at Uber is just horrible. Like, it just can't be, maybe, but this doesn't seem likely that that's the case.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, look, there are bad eggs everywhere, yep. Right? You can find them in almost every culture. Hopefully in many cultures they get worked out of the system. Sounds like that may not be happening here. But I personally have friends who work with Uber who are fabulous. So, what this is an opportunity for Uber to clean house and reset and potentially come out stronger. Now, the question is, can they do that with the current leadership, or do they need to have some much more significant changes? I mean, being totally straightforward, can Travis drive that?
Yeah.
Or does somebody else have to step in and take that role? Maybe Travis needs to become the chairman,
yeah.
And you bring in, a grown-up and that's who leads this transformation.
And by the way, that seems like a pretty easy solution. I mean, a pretty obvious solution. Like, there's no reason that Travis would be a good CEO, or anybody at a small company would be a good CEO of a company with thousands of people. So bring in somebody like who's running a division of GE or Disney or something like that. You know, they know what the business is now. You know, bring in a woman or bring in a guy like Jeff Jordan or somebody who can fix everything. It seems like that's a pretty straightforward, and it seems like they're at least on the COO level, they're trying to do that.
I mean, they had a president from Target, right? So they had a grown-up in the room, right. And that didn't seem to make any changes. This is going to take action at every level. So I think not only bringing in somebody who is a grown-up or who has run a diverse organization and wants to change the culture, but also the board. I mean, there's been some pushback about what Arianna Huffington has said, you know, as she's been going through her...
What did she say?
So they're not done with their assessment, and yet she's already said that there's, you know, that she's not seeing this at a systemic level. And so that seems disingenuous given that she's still going through the process.
Right, and she's not, from her perch, she wouldn't really be able to. On the board, you don't know. Not.
She's on the task force.
Oh, okay.
So there's a task force looking into this. And you know, Uber seems to still be in defense mode. Mm-hmm. And what would be very helpful from my point of view would be for them to basically say, yes, we're a mess. We have so much to fix. Let's talk about how we're going to go fix it, right, instead of doing the CYA on what has already happened. Yeah. And that they're not there yet. And the question is whether they'll get there. Yeah.
Now Lyft it's dangerous. I mean, Lyft isn't trying to like kind of take advantage of it with they have like a social outreach. They have a program now where they're trying to give them, it's called Roundup, which I'm not sure is the best name for something, but it's like they're kind of trying to really put forward the idea that they're very philanthropic and like big ads in the New York Times. And
I mean, I know people at Lyft as well. I also at one point interviewed at Lyft, and they have a completely different culture.
Yeah, no, right? I clearly from the beginning they had to maybe even the detriment of the business, they were trying to build a community of people, and transportation was a way for you to meet other people. You'd sit in the front seat. I mean, that was part of why people didn't take Lyft, because if you just wanted to ride, it was like you didn't want that experience. But I do believe they have a different culture.
Yeah, and you know they've been very smart in how they've responded when there was that pushback around Travis being on Trump's advisory committee. Yeah. You know, they made that $1 million donation to the ACLU. Yep. Yeah. So I think it's smart of them to play those, but there's also the point that they seem to have a value system that may fit better, you know, with employees and customers.
Yeah, for sure. So what is like one to make of the sort of the state of women in Silicon Valley? One thing that's notable and painfully notable in the absence of Hillary Clinton not being president is that some of the most important people are women. Like, women are CEOs of YouTube and Facebook and eBay, IBM, but a couple notable, a couple notable positions there. What does one to make of that?
We're making progress.
Right.
When you think about the state of women in Silicon Valley, though, you have to split it out. You've got women in leadership. Mm-hmm. You've got women on boards. Those two are about how do you develop people who are already, in the system and have the expertise. How do you get them visibility to the roles? How do you make sure that they get paid correctly? I mean, this whole thing, regardless of what you feel about Marissa Mayer, the idea that the new Yahoo CEO is going to make double what she makes, those are, right. You got to keep an eye on that. But that's one group. Then you have the engineers, which you brought up earlier. Mm-hmm. I think you have to have other programs to really push that. And we have a pipeline problem there. You've got less than 20% of engineers, computer science and engineers graduating right. are female. Therefore, you're going to continue to have a pipeline problem.
And why is that? like what? Like I don't. Didn't it used to be? My understanding is that like in the 60s, 70s, women were like most of the engineers, or half the engineers, or a lot of the engineers, or.
The stat I know is that in 74 it was 37% of the students. Right. And it's a good question. I mean, you've seen that same dip that we just talked about. You've seen that dip on the political spectrum too. And some posit that this is about women having more choice and they, choose not to go that route.
Interesting, yeah.
So it may be that 50-50 in some of these areas is just not the natural paradigm because that's not where women choose to go. I think when I think about equality, it's about making sure that the people who are qualified and want to be there have the same access as men and the same potential. Where that brings us on an equilibrium perspective, it remains to be seen.
There's also an issue that I'm not an engineer. Silicon Valley, there's a lot of other jobs. And in fact, Sheryl Sandberg's she's not an engineer. She came up she was on politics, I think. She was out in Washington. And so there's also the concept, if the issue is women participating in companies and the wealth creation, you can also do other things. If you want to be a business development person, a salesperson, a finance person, it seems like when I talk to Wall Street firms, there's plenty of women at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. I mean, maybe I'm probably getting that industry wrong, but it seems like that would be a pretty male-dominated industry. But there seem to be a lot more women running around running things in that industry than we have here.
Yeah, I don't know the stats between the two of them. I think we're making
I'm just
progress.
making up. It's because we're a post-fact world. Whatever.
That's right. Alternative facts. Why do we need the truth?
Whatever suits your purpose.
So I feel like we're making progress at the top. There are organizations like Athena that drives women getting on boards, and that's been a big push in 2017. And you're right, you don't have to be an engineer, male or female, to be successful in Silicon Valley. There is an issue of developing talent, though, and really deciding that you are going to look for people who have raw material and really drive them through the system. And I find in the last two startups I was at, I found women who were actually both of the office managers when I came into those companies now have operating roles because they had great talent. Yep. That was their entry, and they weren't super aggressive about saying, hey, I want something different. But when the conversation came up, it was an interest. And so, helping those individuals get into strong operating roles is another way to help the process.
Right. And is there something that women do to help other women in Silicon Valley? I had one of my podcasts was about, is there a gay mafia in Silicon Valley? With a guy who's a gay CEO. And his answer was, no, but we're trying to create one. Pretty good. But is there something, is there a thing that women can do to help other women? Or is it like, well, you'd never ask a guy that question, right? Like, what do you do to help other guys? You're just like, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think actually, I would say that there's an overabundance of organizations where women are trying to help women. I can't figure out which ones to go to and where to get involved. At the grassroots level, it's literally about getting to know other women who have similar roles or are in your organizations and literally thinking of them to recommend them for roles and sharing opportunities. And so I have a group of people, several groups of women actually, with whom, they're either mentors of mine or they are people I bounce ideas off of, or we just get together and share ideas. And all that cross-pollination, it's something that men have tended to do more in the business world, and I'm using a very that's a very broad brush statement, because not when women in tech get together, they're not always talking about business, but making sure that business is high on that discussion list definitely. It just opens up the same opportunities. It's basically a replication of what the men already do in the Valley.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to a dinner party, talking to a woman recently, and she said, the one thing she's learned is two things she learned as an adult that she wished she knew when she was younger. She's like, one, I don't know how to say this, but she's like, people who you think just knew immensely more than you did, like doctors, and just you couldn't fathom knowing that much. they don't really know that much more than you do. Like it's not that big a gap. And the second thing is like, it's 90% who you know. And when somebody says something like, oh, well, he just hired his buddy or whatever, it's like that's 90% of, like, if you're a friend of Sheryl Sandberg's, she probably helps you get a job at Facebook, for example.
It's true. It's true. I mean, you go off to do a job search. You're not spending all your time looking at LinkedIn. Maybe you're going to see something in there. You're talking to executive recruiters. And more importantly, you're calling, your old contacts and having coffee, because that's where the plum opportunities are really going to show up.
Yeah. How did you come to industrial engineering, by the way? Like, what did you... one of the things we talk about a lot, there's a podcast where it's the Harry Stebbings podcast, and he interviews all venture capitalists. Have you heard of this podcast at all?
I love the podcast.
Okay, he's great. He's this 19-year-old from London, and everybody's the best person he's ever talked to. He's fabulous. And every time he asks a guy, almost invariably a white guy who went to either Stanford or Princeton or Harvard, how they got into venture capital, they fell into it, is always the answer. Which, for starters, like they didn't fall into it from like the housing projects of Chicago. They fell into it from like being at Stanford, and their buddy started like a venture capital firm, and that's how they ended up there. And by the way, you should come up with a better answer. Like, even if that's how you got into venture capital, like make something up. Like there's nothing more rich white privilege. Like in a venture industry, which really has an issue with not having enough women and not having minorities, like don't walk around saying you just fell into it. Like you dreamed about it since you were a child. But anyway, so did you fall into being an industrial engineer?
I think it's fair if you landed somewhere to tell that story.
I know.
I mean, it's not as good if they're on your podcast.
But exactly. Make something up. Like every company that the Pez dispenses at eBay, everybody makes up some founding story. Like, oh, I always want to be a venture capitalist, and I worked really hard, and one day think of something like, I actually had a Canadian venture capitalist on. I actually heard there was a woman on, I forget, it wasn't his podcast, it was on a related podcast, who's a venture capitalist. And her story was she came to this country from Mozambique with no money in her pocket. I'm like, okay, there you go.
You just got to find the people with the good stories. So industrial engineering, I was just a kid who was destined for engineering. So I hated dolls. Mm-hmm. I was just an enigma to my family in that way, and was always building things, and was into, light bright and rearranging. Like one day my mom came home, I had rearranged the spice cabinet, and because my maternal grandfather had been an engineer, my mom, who is a chemist and also had a very non-traditional career, was basically said to me, oh, you have an engineering mind. And she planted the seed, and I, got into computers at a very early age. I had a, Commodore 64 and the TI, and got really involved in that, loved math and science. And with her support and really her, direction there, I continued to go down that route. And so when I went to look at schools, there was actually the option. I grew up in New Jersey, and there was, I grew up in North Brunswick. Rutgers was in New Brunswick, in-state tuition, and I wanted out of New Jersey so badly. Nothing against the state, insert joke here, but I just wanted adventure. And Georgia Tech had and still has the best industrial engineering program in the country. And I was like, I'm going to go check that out. So that's how I
You're like a Bruce Springsteen song, basically. You got out of New Jersey.
Yes, although he's a huge fan of New Jersey.
I know. Well, that is true. But he also has a very nice house in Beverly Hills that I think he spends a couple of minutes at.
Yes. And one on the Jersey Shore where it's beautiful.
I'm sure.
Red Bank Rumson.
Yeah, it's funny. So it sounds like you were kind of encouraged to be an engineer or do those things. And a lot of people talk about that. Although if you think about a lot of the iconic people who became engineers, they actually weren't encouraged. Like it didn't, when I was growing up, if somebody was into computers, it was over their parents' strenuous objections that they not be out playing football or doing something social. Like they kind of had to fight it to do it. Like, nobody was encouraging kids to go use their Commodore 64 when I was growing up. They were like, hey, kiddo, go out and why don't you, go out for the track team or something like that. It's just kind of, it's I don't know.
Those activities were not mutually exclusive.
Well, that is true.
So there is something there. And I think back to that question about pipeline, there's research that shows when people make these decisions, and it's actually super early. Like, it's in elementary school when you decide if you like math or not.
Yeah.
And so the relationship that people have to math changes whether or not they're going to go into, engineering and the hard sciences, computer science. And so really this comes back to that whole question of how do you encourage men and women, but especially in this case women, to go down that path, because it is not the natural place that women tend to gravitate.
Yeah, it sounds like you don't have to encourage. The other part too that I always think about is like, you don't have to encourage people. Like, I did the computers and I was like, it's too hard for me. Like, for me, I would rather read a book and write an essay about like Chaucer. So if you push me to do, if there's a woman who just maybe doesn't like the whole computer thing, that's fine too. Like, as long as you have the opportunity, it seems like, to nerd out. Because I had the opportunity and I was like, nah, not for me. Too hard. Takes too much time.
Yeah. At the end of the day, this is about helping people figure out what their passions are and nurturing their passions. And I think the hypothesis is that there are women who are naturally drawn to math and to computers that are not encouraged, and in many cases discouraged from going that route. And so the idea that they know about women who have gone that route, they understand what the jobs look like, even if there's no one else in their family who is in that world, they, have access to resources. That's really what this is about, not turning everyone into engineers. We need our liberal arts people and we need other roles. And frankly, liberal arts educations are amazing. I did not have one because I went for an engineering education. I covet everybody else's, spend my time reading through all of the lists of books to make sure that
it's super fun.
Absolutely.
like doing liberal arts. Yeah, I back up my point with the recent Goldbergs, which has a nerd girl on it, which they said was rare back in the... Do you ever watch that show?
I have not watched it.
Oh, it's fabulous.
I'll check it out.
It's like this family. It's the guy who did it. It's about his life in the 80s. So if you kind of were around in the 80s, everything is just like hilariously retro. It's very entertaining. But so that's just like a couple of last things. Did you have any role models, like when sounds like your mom was one of them, but I mean, is that it? Just like seeing somebody and going, oh, I could do that.
Role models. Yeah, I would say that what my mom taught me, and starting with her because she was a very powerful figure in my childhood, is she was part of the women's lib movement. She never marched. She just did. She just was like the only chemist in her team. And then she was, she basically walked the walk. Mm-hmm. And she advocated and she was against any injustices, anything that got in my way or my sister's way or her way, she would go fight it out. And so from that perspective, just realizing the world doesn't have to be the way it was a very powerful lesson.
Yep.
Beyond that, I don't have actually people who I'm like, I want to be just like them. There are definitely individuals that I have tremendous respect for. I'd put Sheryl Sandberg in that list. I mean, she is someone who is very open and warm and shares her life with the world and, hasn't always gotten, she's had some hard times.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But she's also excelled in so many areas and she's created opportunities for others, right? And that is something that I would love to see more of in Silicon Valley, is this idea that success is about pulling everyone else up with you. Yep. She really embodies that.
Yeah, she is pretty, like, it is pretty amazing. Like, she's had tough times. She's like running a very successful company. She goes to bed at like 9:30 at night and leaves work every day at 6:30. But everything she does, I mean, obviously she's running the company, but everything she does externally it's about kind of different women's things. Like I'm a friend of hers on Facebook, and it's like it'll be, here's women in small business in India. It's like she's using her power to do like if you watch what she's doing, it's a very particular. She doesn't talk a lot about like operations or cloud infrastructure or anything that you might talk about as a thought leader. It's a very particular thing she sort of decided to focus on, and it's very impressive.
Yeah, and her collaborations with Adam Grant are really interesting as well.
That's her new. What is that collaboration?
So they did a set of articles in the New York Times that were on various topics around people dynamics. Some of it was about women. Some of it was on other topics. She has her new book coming out, yep. Plan B. Yep. And I know there's some relationship there. In fact, I believe they're both coming to speak at the Commonwealth Club. And so yep. There's, she's involved. When I think about what she gets involved in, obviously she's doing a lot in the women's world, but she's also, in driving women empowerment, she's also just trying to create a community in Silicon Valley that has more equality and, and where people are doing the things they want to do.
Yeah, it's impressive. Well, so I'll wrap up, but what is your advice? What's your advice to somebody running a company, like when they think about how they want to treat women or do something to contribute other than, if you're being a horrible person, stop it. What's your thought that somebody should think about who's maybe not thinking about it a lot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say think about it. A lot of this is simply being thoughtful and explicit. The second is you think about your raw talent and don't filter for just what people have done. One of the biases we see in Silicon Valley is that people are looked at for what they do, not necessarily what they can do. And there's so many athletes out there and look at people as athletes, look at their skills, take the time to have the conversation with them about where they want to get to. You'll have better employees that way if you know what their passions are and you're helping them get there. But, at the end of the day, it's about being explicit and making sure that your culture is someplace that's open to everyone, performing well and reaching their goals.
That's fantastic. Okay, now I'm really self-conscious about interrupting you. Mission accomplished.
No interruptions. Well done.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this. This has been great.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks a lot. This has been a Something Ventured podcast. Thanks for listening.